All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Good to see you. Um, Here we are again with Financing Philadelphia's Future. Let's start with the usual. Please set your screen for speaker view. That's the best way to watch this using the icon. And generally, it's in that top right side of your screen. Um, Enter the questions in the chat, letting us know which section of the city you're from. For example, Mount Airy, West Mount Airy, East Mount Airy, et cetera, et cetera. And if you want to join the Public Banking Coalition, enter your email and your name in the chat so we can put you in our database. All right, this is a quick half hour, so we're going to move forward. And I'd like to introduce our speaker today. There we go. All right, today we have Geeta Minocha, and here's her bio. Geeta Minocha is a Public Banking Institute board member who leads in the development and implementation of national policies and initiatives that advance democratizing money through public banking, our big issue. In 2022, she founded the Ohio Public Banking Coalition, and they use a slightly different strategy than we do. We'll have her talk about that. And let's see what else about her. The model has been a model for public banking movements in conservative regions, building a statewide coalition with numerous public and private sector stakeholders. So we'll hear a little bit more from her. Geeta has a background in financial and healthcare policy. She previously served as a health policy research fellow and held the director of equity position at Johns Hopkins Tobacco Treatment Clinic. Welcome, Geeta. All right, I'm going to shut that down, and then we're going to get into a conversation with Geeta. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. And let's get started by tell us a little bit about the Ohio situation. When did that get started? What were some of the milestones, and where does it stand right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, Vanessa, Peter, Connie, thank you guys so much for having me. And thanks to everybody joining the call today. I spent 4 years in Philadelphia for college and absolutely fell in love with the city. So I'm so excited to be here engaging with all of you to talk about the great work that you guys are also doing. So again, thank you so much. I think before I talk about what we're up to in Ohio, it's important to give you guys the context in the state. So historically, we are a banking state. I mean, there are no two ways about it. Several major banks were started in the state of Ohio: Huntington, Fifth Third, KeyBank. And that means there is a very strong private financial lobby, both in banking and in the shadow banking sectors. We are home, for example, to one of the largest payday lending sectors in the entire country. These are all stakeholders and lobbying groups that advocates on the ground have to grapple with, and we knew that going in. Some additional political and historical context that I think is important. I mean, it's no secret, so many communities around the country have been redlined and reverse redlined for decades now. Ohio is no stranger to that, but my neck of the woods, Cleveland, Ohio, was one of the worst cities in the country for that. I mean, so many neighborhoods were critically redlined and reverse redlined, continue to suffer from the aftermath of the financial crisis and those shady business practices from the big banks. So that means a lot of people mistrust the private sector in Ohio communities. Add on top of that an additional layer. We are a very corrupt political government, right? I mean, this is probably a story that folks have heard around the country by now, but there are a number of political corruption scandals that we have dealt with in recent years. So in addition to residents not trusting the private markets, they don't trust their government. And that's a very reasonable mistrust that we are also trying to navigate in our coalition. Now, the final contextual point that I think is so critical: Democrats are operating in a super minority in the state legislature. This isn't to say that public banking is a partisan issue, far from it, but I think historically the messaging around banking reform and public banking in particular has been such that Democrats and progressives more easily find a home within it than conservatives do. And because Dems are operating in that super minority, and I'm talking 7 members in the state Senate to give you some context, 7 members, not a lot. State House, it's a comparably low figure. That means that a lot of the political strategy that we employ as well as the language in the bill that we push has to be tailored towards the Republican market in Ohio. And I think that is the sum total of context that you guys need. I'm going on and on about it, but let's jump into what we're doing at the Ohio Public Banking Coalition, my baby. So we've got this coalition that is statewide. It spans, countless cities and communities. We've got rural areas, very agricultural communities in the state of Ohio. We've also got very typical urban mid-sized cities, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Columbus. So we've got a very broad-based coalition that spans generations, ethnic groups. You name it. We're very excited about that. For the last 2 years, we've just been trying to grow and expand that coalition, introduce this idea of public finance and changing the narrative around what government can do for people. Now it's time to actually get some political victories. We've drafted this bill. We've been very, very excited about it. Unlike, I believe, the strategy that's been employed in Pennsylvania so far, we are trying to go fully with a de novo bank through a bill, as opposed to kind of building momentum and ultimately getting to it years down the road. I'm sorry, was there someone who
You're
wanted
just getting
to
some feedback. I think you're good. Keep going.
Got it. So we've drafted this bill that will create a state bank of Ohio. And it is essentially a revolving loan fund plus a little extra, plus some additional provisions that include banking access for underbanked individuals, and some provisions that would loop in community banks and provide them with extra lines of credit to increase their bottom lines. But we originally thought that we were going to get this bill through in this legislative session. And I was speaking to Peter before we started the show today. We actually just received some rather disappointing news about our efforts this year. While we thought originally that we would get this through in this legislative session, it's now looking like we're going to have to kind of shift gears and look towards the 2025 legislative session in order to introduce it and to hopefully push it through. But one of the things that we're very, very excited about with this bill and with our current advocacy is over the last several months, as we've been cultivating relationships with our lawmakers and with other stakeholders, we've seen a great deal of excitement and support from our Republican friends, who of course are going to be critical to ultimately passing this bill. We just got word this morning that the state legislature is going to approve $1 billion in targeted infrastructure investment spending. And there are a number of lawmakers in the state that have specifically pointed to the work that we're doing in the coalition as the reason for that expenditure. There are a lot of issues in the state that we have flagged over the course of our advocacy in the last few months. And in anticipation of our bill being introduced, lawmakers wanted to push this $1 billion investment expenditure as kind of a piecemeal sort of solution to the broader solution that we have proposed. And so they're hoping to return to this in a year's time and actually create that sustainable long-term solution that we've drafted in this bill.
Okay, wow, great background, and thank you for starting with sort of the larger context. Congratulations on the $1 billion in infrastructure expenditures. That's fantastic.
Yeah, we're excited about it.
But let's go back to when did the coalition start?
Yeah, so I founded the coalition in probably first quarter 2022. I was a law student at the time. And I love telling this story because it speaks to the power of community and grassroots organizing. This coalition began because there was some unfortunate bills that I was frustrated about in the state legislature and also in Congress. And I just tweeted one day, frustrated, reach out to me if you guys give a shit about the poor. Excuse my language, but that was the verbatim tweet. And I got literally hundreds of DMs from people all over the state of Ohio saying, here I am, I care about people. I want to know what I can do to help them. What were you thinking? Let's go. And that's how I started introducing Ohio to public banking.
Wonderful. And you said you have like a statewide, just lots of energy. What does it mean to be, is it that they become a member of the coalition? What does that network look like and sort of feel like? How does somebody join that network?
Yeah, so it looks like you guys in Philly have a little bit more of a formal structure than we do in Ohio, especially in the last year or so. The core team's efforts has been pretty much entirely concentrated on building relationships with our lawmakers. So we've sort of ignored some of that continued community building. And when folks want to be a member of OPBC, they just try to join our, I mean, biannual coalition calls and in-person check-ins that we have in cities around the state. If they would like to engage with us in our advocacy in a more tangible way, we hop them on to certain calls. We give them some pamphlets to distribute. We allow them to take meetings with stakeholders in their communities and to share the idea however they feel empowered to do so.
Great, great, great. And you're with the Public Banking Institute, which really looks at it at a national scale. What would you
Yeah.
say about sort of the climate now as on a national scale for public banking?
Yeah, so I'm very fortunate to have been involved with the folks at PBI for a couple of years now. I think I started talking to Walt and Ellen, who are the co-chairs, when I was just starting law school. And I joined the board in summer of 2023 and have been given a sort of bird's eye look at what's going on nationally through that role. I think around the country, we are at a very critical inflection point where banking is concerned. I'm seeing new coalitions and movements pop up every single day. I recently got a message from somebody in Vermont saying they wanted to start a statewide coalition in Vermont and then also push for a city bank in the city of Burlington. So I'm seeing things like that all the time. And of course, we've seen some really material legislative success in California that we are hoping to build off of and kind of continue on that momentum. So it's exciting. I would say one of the things the movement is really ripe for at this moment is changing the overall narrative with which we are speaking about banking, right? Something that's very important to me is recontextualizing banking and financial access as a human right. I mean, in this very increasingly globalized and interconnected world, how can we feasibly tell people to pick themselves up by their bootstraps when we know they don't have the tools with which to do so, right? I mean, every generation should be pushing the envelope where rights and where standard of living are concerned. You know, generations previous were focused on food, water, shelter, some basic political rights. Most recently, that conversation has evolved to include things like healthcare and climate justice. Now, I think it's time that we further push that narrative to include financial access, access to the markets, banking access as a whole.
Absolutely, absolutely. Peter, I'm going to turn to you. Do we have some questions?
We do, Vanessa. We have a question from Stan asking, what is the particular pitch that you think is working best with Republican legislators?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have had to do a little bit of trial and error with this in Ohio because something that we get right away from every Republican is, well, okay, what you're saying is great, but here's that socialist, communist, Marxist, whatever-ist aspect of banking as you are presenting it that sounds a little foreign to us. But we find that ultimately what gets through to them are two things. The first is a message for lower rates for the taxpayer over time, right? I mean, we've seen in North Dakota, certainly, that the reinvestment from the Bank of North Dakota into the state has saved taxpayers in the state a lot of money over the years. And of course, Republicans love that. The second thing that they appreciate is the idea of supplementing local and state finances, right? I mean, I think that's probably the biggest use case for public banking right now, that governments turn to the bond markets, but sometimes they're unreliable. And in the event of a poor bond market, like we saw in 2022, there's got to be an additional supplementary source of financing so that governments can give their residents the services they are promised.
Yeah, really good points.
So,
Go ahead, Peter.
Geeta, who have you found to be your most loyal and effective allies in this fight, and who have been the most intransigent and difficult opponents?
Yeah. Okay. So I think the most loyal allies, I believe is how you phrased it. Unsurprisingly, they're the people who have traditionally been disenfranchised in the state of Ohio, right? They're the people who don't trust government. They're the people who don't trust banks, who feel like they don't have a stake in the day-to-day in their community. I mean, these are the folks who have the most to gain from an institution like this, and they see that. And I'll also just say this, I mean, I think there's a tendency in politics and policy to almost look down on folks on the ground who don't have a background in whatever policy you're into. And I've seen a lot of folks do this in finance and banking because it can get so very complicated. But I'll tell you this, when you speak to people on the ground and you have a real conversation with them, even though they may not be able to articulate some of the same concerns that folks like us in these organizing spaces are talking about on a regular basis, they do understand that there is a problem, and they understand that there is room to push government a little bit more to fix that problem.
So
And what was the second part of your question, Peter? I'm sorry, I missed it.
a follow up on the first part. It sounds like most of the members of the coalition are acting as individuals rather than as advocacy groups, such as advocates for affordable housing and for minority small business development and things like that. Is that correct? Is it individuals more than organizations?
Sorry, let me clarify what you're asking. Are you asking if people are taking individual steps to advocate for banking, or are they doing it in teams? I don't quite follow.
The members of the coalition who are most helpful and effective, from what you said, they seem to be individuals as opposed to organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. That's been our experience so far. The Republicans with whom we've seen the greatest success are the Republicans representing Appalachian communities in Ohio. And they see on a regular basis that their constituencies are extraordinarily disenfranchised, completely disconnected from the markets, and in desperate need of access to them. So getting those phone calls on a regular basis from their constituencies has been really paramount.
So the other side of the question was, who were your most intransigent and difficult opponents? And Stan Shapiro asked, are the bank lobbyists showing up in public or operating mostly behind the scenes?
Yeah. Our most challenging opponents so far have been, interestingly enough, CDFIs, Community Development Financial Institutions. Context that I should have laid out at the very beginning of this call, I think, is that Ohio is also home to a really large and robust ecosystem of CDFIs, particularly in its cities. In Cleveland, for example, I mean, you can't go 2 blocks without running into a handful of CDFIs. And so they're all competing for public money. And that's caused some problems for us because, I mean, this is just a fault of our advocacy, I think, so far that we're hoping to remedy. They feel like if a public bank comes into the picture, then suddenly they have access to all the capital that was traditionally allocated for these CDFIs. And so they feel like it's a zero-sum game in that respect.
We've been fairly successful in Philadelphia in diffusing that concern and convincing the CDFI community that the public bank and the financial authority that we've been proposing will support them and give them resources rather than compete with them. So the next question from Pamela is, why did you decide to go with a revolving loan fund when your initial intention was to go to a bank that was able to engage in fractional banking?
Yeah. It's because the Republicans that we need in order to get anything passed would not accept fractional banking just yet. And we thought if we created a state bank of Ohio that did everything up to that point of fractional banking, that taking that next step within a couple of legislative cycles would be totally feasible.
That's the same conclusion we came to in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
Anything else, Peter?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm seeing that there are a couple of extra questions in the chat. I don't know if we wanted to do those.
Yeah, Peter.
Sid has a follow-up question. Will the legislation protect against the powers that be using the bank for their own purposes, building stadiums for sports teams, for instance?
I'm so sorry. I didn't understand the question. Could you say that one more time, Peter?
Does the legislation include protections against abuse of your public bank for the purposes like building stadiums for sports teams and supporting other private interests rather than public interests?
Got it. So I don't know who asked this question in the chat, but it sounds like they've got some familiarity with the politics in cities across Ohio, because this is a big controversy in Ohio right now that private sports vendors and stadium owners and whatnot are getting a lot of government money. In any case, the answer to this question is a very complex one. At a high level, every public bank, including any bank that we would start in Ohio through whatever legislation we ultimately pass, is going to require some degree of citizen input in order to make sure that it's doing right by the community. Now, this isn't to say that the citizen board or whatever body is going to make decisions on behalf of the bank, but there does need to be some sort of external body that liaises between the bank and the government and the public as well.
Is that going to be accomplished in the governance structure or as an advisory committee on the outside?
So in Ohio, we included that into our structure, but of course, in other communities and other states and movements, it can vary.
Okay.
While Peter looks through the other
question.
questions. Oh, okay, go ahead, Stan.
Yeah, just follow up. So exactly how would the and Pamela's getting into this too. How does the governance structure work, and how much is it required that whoever is running the institution actually take into account whatever the advisory committee offers them?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's no clear framework on how they engage with the advisory committee, right? I mean, I think offering some sort of top-down information there through legislation is overwhelming for lawmakers and also probably not practical, simply because, you know, this is going to have to be a little bit of a learning experience once a bank gets going. The way that we've structured it in Ohio is that we have a bank board that is appointed, but then we have an external institution that we call part of the bank, an external advisory institution that is elected. And it includes a number of stakeholders from different communities.
Thank you.
Yeah, very helpful. So Geeta, we got as far as a piece of legislation to create an entity that then would eventually create the bank. Unfortunately, and it passed, 15-1. But unfortunately, our last mayor did not move forward on it. So we were so close. So one of the things we've done is we're continuing to have the conversation, and we'll, continue pushing this, but we've now sort of developed a campaign that we call Bring Our Money Home, that really starts to engage the faith institutions. A lot of us are involved with Power, which is a statewide coalition of faith institutions, and asking the faith institutions to essentially get their money out of the national banks that are not doing anything for the city of Philadelphia, and sort of using that mantra of we need to bring our money home because the people who are holding it are not really supporting Philadelphia, and we can do better. So this is a social justice movement that individuals and individual institutions here in Philadelphia can support by moving their money to local minority depository institutions, credit unions, and other institutions where we know that the money will stay more local. You've hit a snag in the legislation I think that you were about to bring forward. Can you tell us what happened with that snag? So why didn't it go through?
Yeah.
You all are thinking about maybe sort of more sort of individual institution or people-based kind of initiative.
Yeah, it's been a real learning experience for all of us engaging with our legislator in this way. I'm happy you brought this up because I think this is a point that other organizers can learn from, because this certainly caught us by surprise. We were expecting to get this through in this session. We had identified two co-sponsors for this bill, two Democratic co-sponsors, and one of them was termed out this session. We thought he was an ideal candidate because of that lame duck status. We assumed that he had nothing better to do. He didn't care if he was courting controversy, and that this would also be an interesting legacy-defining legislation for him. And actually what happened is, in the continued communication between his office and what's called in Ohio the LSC, that external body that engages with lawmakers to kind of fine-tune bills and make sure they comport with the Constitution and existing laws. In those communications, they decided that there were a number of legal and constitutional concerns that they were uncomfortable with in our draft legislation. Now, we wanted to work with them on this, and we sent them a follow-up memo addressing all of those concerns that they'd laid out for us. And they responded saying, look, okay, maybe you're onto something here, but the truth of it is, for us to determine that, we would have to spend literally all of the resources we currently have over the next couple of months until the filing deadline, which in Ohio is May 15th, in order to make sure that what you're saying is true. So we just simply do not have the time and the resources this session to devote to understanding your bill at this high and deep level. And so what that means for us is over the next year or so, we're going to have to continue that conversation with that external body to iron out some of those constitutional concerns. Now, one of the things I want to flag is, again, we picked this guy because he was termed out, and we thought that would be really advantageous for us when in fact it wasn't. And one of the things he told our team specifically was, look, in theory, we could have done this session. It's just that it seems like a really heavy lift, and because my time is running out, I would rather spend that time on some of the low-hanging fruit in front of me that can really define my time in the legislature and that I know is going to serve my constituents.
Yeah. I think particularly the Public Banking Institute and others working on the national scale need to collect these challenges that we're all facing. You know, is it that some mayor doesn't want to push it forward, and I think we hit some of the sort of, the legal department was asking a lot of questions that we couldn't answer. And so, sort of compiling the sort of quick and it's never going to be quick answers, but compiling those stories, I think, would be very helpful. Peter, we've got, I think.
Geeta, we discovered the importance of the banking law because Philadelphia was not empowered to create a bank by itself. That's why we had to create this other framework that could create a bank. Only the state in Pennsylvania, only the state can create a bank.
So is there,
directly.
Was there any
authorize
Republican majority in either house at the time when it started? It started out with a statewide effort to create a bank, and we did not get until the last year or so a one-vote majority in only the assembly, and we still don't have a majority in the Senate. So
all right, we've got
then
2
looked
minutes.
at the city.
Well, if I could add.
Go ahead, quickly add something, and then we've got to wrap up. Go ahead, Geeta.
I wasn't going to add anything. I was going to ask if there was any hope of maybe starting a public corporation and using that as the approach, since, of course, the city is not empowered to start a bank.
Let's have one person respond to that. Is that you, Peter?
The Philadelphia Public Financial Authority will be constituted as a corporation
Got it.
as soon as the mayor makes the appointments of the initial board members. Then the city solicitor can file for incorporation with the Pennsylvania Secretary of State.
Perfect. Take it away, Vanessa. Sorry about that.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Geeta. We're on our last minute here. Want to remind folks that we do this every month on the last Tuesday of the month. Come join us. Thank you for joining us. Join us again next month.